The morning sun climbed slowly over London, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. At Buckingham Palace, the day started like any other. The massive gate stood tall and proud, while tourists from around the world gathered on the sidewalk, their cameras ready to capture memories of their trip to England. By noon, the crowd had grown thick. Families with excited children pressed against the black iron railings. Elderly couples held hands as they pointed at the magnificent building. Young backpackers snapped selfies with the palace in the background. Everyone seemed happy and peaceful, but there was something different about one person in the crowd. A man in his late 20s stood apart from the others. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty. His hair looked like he hadn't washed it in days. Dark circles under his eyes told a story of sleepless nights. While everyone else looked up at the palace with wonder, his eyes were focused on something else entirely. The man pushed through the crowd roughly. He bumped into a mother carrying her baby, making her stumble. He stepped on an old man's foot without saying sorry. Parents quickly pulled their children closer when they saw him coming. Something about him made people uncomfortable, though they couldn't quite say what it was. Standing guard at their posts were the Queen's Guards. These soldiers were famous around the world for their bright red uniforms and tall black fuzzy hats called bearskins. They stood perfectly still like statues. Their rifles were held in the exact same position, not moving even an inch. Tourists often tried to make them smile or laugh, but the guards never broke their serious expression. People thought these guards were just for show, like actors in a play. They looked so formal and old-fashioned with their uniforms that belonged to another century. Many visitors assumed they were there just to look pretty for photos. But they were wrong. These men were real soldiers, trained to protect the royal family and the palace. They had spent months learning how to handle any kind of trouble. The strange man in the crowd kept getting closer to the gates. His hands were shaking and sweat dripped down his face even though the day wasn't very hot. Police officers stationed around the area started to notice him. They'd seen many odd people over the years, but something about this man set off alarm bells in their heads. One officer, a woman who had worked at the palace for 5 years, nudged her partner. "Keep an eye on that guy in the torn jacket," she whispered. Her partner looked over and immediately understood what she meant. The man's behavior was getting more erratic by the minute. The crowd continued to grow as the afternoon went on. Tour buses dropped off groups of excited visitors. Street performers played music nearby, adding to the festive atmosphere. Children laughed and pointed at the guards, trying to get them to move. Parents explained the history of the palace to their kids, talking about kings and queens who had lived there for hundreds of years. But the disturbed man wasn't interested in history or sightseeing. His eyes were locked on one particular guard standing near the main gate. This young soldier looked to be in his early 20s, standing as straight as a board with his rifle held perfectly in place. The man in the crowd studied the guard's every move, though the soldier barely moved at all. What most people didn't know was that these guards went through incredibly tough training. They learned how to fight, how to use weapons, and most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure. They practiced handling all kinds of dangerous situations, from terrorists to crazy people who might try to hurt the royal family. The young guard had been standing at his post for over an hour. His feet were starting to hurt and the heavy bearskin hat made his head sweat, but he didn't move a muscle. He'd been trained to ignore discomfort and stay focused on his job. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd constantly, looking for anything unusual. He noticed the strange man too. The guard's training kicked in automatically. Without moving his head or changing his expression, he kept track of where the man was and what he was doing. The guard's grip on his rifle stayed the same, but inside he was getting ready for trouble. The police officers were also getting more worried. They started moving closer to the suspicious man, but they had to be careful. They couldn't just arrest someone for looking strange or acting weird. They needed him to actually do something wrong first. So they watched and waited, ready to spring into action if needed. Other tourists started to notice the tension too, though they didn't fully understand what was happening. Some people moved away from the strange man without really knowing why. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter. The happy, carefree mood of the crowd began to shift slightly. The man's breathing got faster and faster. His eyes darted around nervously, but they always came back to the guard and his rifle. He wiped his sweaty palms on his dirty jeans and took a step closer to the barrier that separated the public from the palace grounds. An elderly man standing nearby tried to be friendly. "Beautiful day to visit the palace, isn't it?" he said with a warm smile. But the strange man just stared at him with wild eyes and didn't answer. The elderly man quickly moved away, feeling uncomfortable. The afternoon sun was getting stronger, making the red uniforms of the guards look even brighter. The golden decorations on the palace sparkled in the light. Everything looked perfect and peaceful, like a scene from a postcard. But under the surface, tension was building like a storm cloud about to burst. The guard continued his silent watch. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that trouble was coming. He'd dealt with difficult people before. Sometimes tourists got too pushy trying to take photos. Occasionally someone had too much to drink and got rowdy. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. The strange man moved even closer to the barrier. Now he was right at the front of the crowd, just a few feet away from where the guard stood. Other people started backing away, sensing that something bad might happen. The happy chatter of the crowd grew quieter. Police officers began moving in from different directions, trying to surround the area without being too obvious about it. They spoke quietly into their radios, calling for backup just in case. Their hands moved closer to their weapons, though they kept them hidden from the public. The man's whole body was trembling now. He looked like a spring wound, too tight, ready to snap at any moment. His eyes were fixed on the guard's rifle with an intensity that made everyone around him nervous. Whatever was going through his mind, it wasn't good. A mother with 2 young children noticed the strange man and quickly led her family away. "Let's go see the gift shop," she told her kids, even though they wanted to stay and watch the guards. Her protective instincts told her to get her children far away from whatever was about to happen. The guard remained perfectly still, but every muscle in his body was ready to react. Years of training had prepared him for this exact moment. He knew that sometimes people tried to test the guards or cause trouble for attention, but he also knew that some people were truly dangerous, and he couldn't tell which kind this man was until it was too late. The crowd continued to thin out as more people felt the growing tension and decided to move on. Street performers packed up their instruments and left. Even the police horses seemed nervous, stepping from side to side and flicking their ears. The strange man took one more step forward, now pressed right against the barrier. His breathing was so fast and shallow that he looked like he might pass out. Sweat poured down his face and his hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly. Everyone who saw him knew that something terrible was about to happen. The peaceful afternoon at Buckingham Palace was about to turn into chaos, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The moment happened so fast that most people couldn't believe what they were seeing. 1 second, the strange man was standing behind the barrier with everyone else. The next second, he was flying through the air like a crazy person. Without any warning at all, the man grabbed the top of the iron barrier and pulled himself up. His dirty sneakers scraped against the metal as he swung his legs over. People around him screamed and jumped back. A little girl started crying. Her father picked her up and ran toward the street. "Stop right there," shouted a police officer. But the man wasn't listening to anyone. He hit the ground running on the palace side of the barrier. His torn jacket flapped behind him as he sprinted across the forbidden area, where no regular person was supposed to go. The guard he was running toward didn't move a muscle. This was the moment all his training had prepared him for. While tourists panicked and police officers shouted, the young soldier stayed perfectly calm. His eyes tracked the approaching threat, calculating distance and speed like a computer. Other tourists couldn't understand why the guard wasn't running away or calling for help. They thought he was frozen with fear, but they were wrong. The guard was doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. He was staying in position and getting ready to defend himself in the palace. The man running toward him looked completely out of his mind. His eyes were wide and wild like an animal caught in a trap. Spit flew from his mouth as he gasped for air. His hands were stretched out in front of him, reaching for the guard's rifle like it was the most important thing in the world. "He's got a gun." "Run!" someone screamed, though that wasn't true. The man didn't have any weapon except for his bare hands and his crazy determination. But in moments like this, fear makes people see things that aren't really there. Police officers were running after him, but they were too far away. The man had gotten a head start, and he was moving faster than anyone expected. His desperation gave him speed that surprised everyone watching. The crowd behind the barrier was in complete chaos. Some people were running away as fast as they could. Others stood frozen, too shocked to move. Many people held up their phones, recording everything that was happening. Later, these videos would be watched by millions of people around the world. A tour guide tried to keep her group calm. "Everyone stay together," she called out, but her voice was shaking with fear. She'd been giving tours of London for 10 years, but she'd never seen anything like this before. The guard's partner, standing about 20 feet away, started to move toward the action. But he also had to stay at his post unless he got direct orders to leave. These guards were trained to follow rules even in the middle of chaos. They couldn't just abandon their positions because of one crazy person. More police were arriving from all directions. Their radios crackled with urgent messages. "Man on the grounds! Man on the grounds!" they reported to headquarters. Within seconds, backup units were speeding toward the palace from across London. The running man was getting closer and closer to the guard. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The guard could see the madness in the man's eyes, could hear his heavy breathing and pounding footsteps on the ancient stones of the palace courtyard. What the man didn't understand was that these guards weren't just pretty decorations. They were real soldiers who had trained for months to handle exactly this kind of situation. They knew how to fight. They knew how to use weapons. And most importantly, they knew how to stay calm when everyone else was losing their minds. The guard's rifle was an SA-80, a serious military weapon that could cause real damage if used properly. But the guard wasn't planning to shoot anyone unless he absolutely had to. His training taught him to use the minimum amount of force necessary to stop a threat. 5 feet away now. The man's hands were almost close enough to touch the rifle barrel. His face was twisted with effort and determination. Whatever had driven him to do, this crazy thing was powerful enough to make him ignore all the shouting police officers and screaming tourists. The guard could smell the man's unwashed body and see the dirt under his fingernails. He could tell that this person hadn't been taking care of himself for a long time. Mental illness, drugs, or just plain desperation had driven him to this point, but the guard didn't have time to feel sorry for the man. His job was to protect the palace and everyone around it. If this person got hold of a military weapon, people could get seriously hurt or killed. The guard had to act, and he had to act now. The man's fingers were just inches from the rifle now. He was so close he could almost taste victory. In his confused mind, he probably thought he was about to accomplish something important. Maybe he thought taking the guard's weapon would make him famous or powerful. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly at all. Behind them, the crowd watched in horror and fascination. This was like watching a movie, except it was really happening right in front of them. Many people had never seen real violence before, and they didn't know how to react. A businessman in an expensive suit stood with his mouth hanging open. He'd been taking photos of the palace for his wife back home, and now he was witnessing something that would probably be on the evening news. His hands shook as he tried to decide whether to keep filming or run away. 2 teenage girls held on to each other, too scared to move but too curious to look away. They'd come to London for a fun vacation, and now they were seeing something that would give them nightmares for weeks. An older police officer who had worked at the palace for 15 years knew exactly what was about to happen. He'd seen the guards train, and he knew they weren't helpless victims. "This is going to end badly for that idiot," he muttered to his partner. The man's hand touched the rifle barrel. Cold metal met warm skin. For just a split second, he thought he had won. He thought he had successfully grabbed a weapon from one of the Queen's guards. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The guard felt the man's sweaty palm close around his rifle. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. All those months of training, all those hours of practice, all those lessons about staying calm under pressure were about to be put to the ultimate test. Time seemed to slow down. The shouting voices of the police became distant. The screams of the tourists faded into background noise. For the guard, the whole world narrowed down to just him, the attacker, and the rifle between them. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything. The moment the man's hand wrapped around the rifle barrel, the guard's training kicked in like lightning. All those months of practice, all those hours of learning how to handle dangerous situations, suddenly became automatic actions that his body performed without even thinking. The guard didn't panic. He didn't freeze up. He didn't try to pull the rifle away from the attacker. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone watching. He used the man's own strength and momentum against him. As the attacker tried to yank the rifle toward himself, the guard suddenly stepped forward and twisted his whole body to the right. This move did two things at once. First, it kept the rifle safely in the guard's hands where it belonged. Second, it used the pulling force from the attacker to throw him completely off balance. The man had been pulling so hard on the rifle that when the guard stepped forward instead of backward, all that force had nowhere to go. It was like trying to open a door that someone suddenly unlocked. The man stumbled forward, completely unprepared for what was happening. But the guard wasn't finished. In one smooth motion that looked almost like a dance move, he spun around behind the attacker. Now the man was between the guard and the palace, with his back exposed and his hand still trying to hold onto a rifle that was no longer where he expected it to be. The guard's left hand shot out and grabbed the back of the man's dirty jacket. His right hand kept a firm grip on his rifle, making sure it stayed secure and pointed safely away from any innocent people. With a quick, controlled movement, the guard used his leg to sweep the attacker's feet right out from under him. The man's eyes went wide with shock and fear. 1 second he thought he was winning. The next second he was flying through the air with nothing to stop his fall except the hard stone ground of the palace courtyard. He hit the ancient stones with a sound that made everyone watching wince. It was the kind of thud that you feel in your bones, like dropping a heavy bag of groceries on a concrete floor. The man's body bounced once, then lay still for a moment, clearly stunned by what had just happened to him. The whole crowd went silent. Even the police officers stopped shouting for a few seconds. Nobody could believe how fast and smooth the guard's movements had been. It was like watching a professional athlete or a movie stunt performer. Except this was real and it was happening right in front of them. The guard immediately stepped back into a defensive position. His rifle was still secure in his hand, still pointed in a safe direction. His face showed no emotion at all, as if throwing a full-grown man to the ground was just another part of his normal daily routine. But inside, his heart was probably pounding like a drum. No matter how much training you have, your first real fight is always scary. The guard had done everything perfectly, but he was still human. The adrenaline rushing through his body made him feel strong and alert, ready to handle whatever happened next. The man on the ground groaned and tried to push himself up with his hands. His palms scraped against the rough stones, leaving small cuts on his skin. His torn jacket was now even more torn, and dirt streaked his face where it had hit the ground. "Stay down," the guard commanded in a loud, clear voice that could be heard across the entire courtyard. This was the first time most tourists had ever heard one of the guards speak, and his authoritative tone made everyone pay attention. The attacker looked up at the guard with confusion and pain in his eyes. He seemed surprised that his simple plan to grab a weapon had gone so wrong so quickly. Maybe he thought the guards were just for show. Maybe he never expected them to fight back. Now he was learning the hard way that these soldiers were the real deal. Police officers came running from all directions, their boots pounding on the pavement. The first officer to reach them was a tall woman who had been watching the whole thing happen from about 50 feet away. She'd started running the moment the man jumped the barrier, but even she was impressed by how quickly the guard had handled the situation. "Well done, soldier," she panted as she reached for her handcuffs. She'd been a police officer for 12 years, and she'd never seen such a perfect takedown. The guard had used exactly the right amount of force, enough to stop the threat, but not enough to seriously hurt anyone. More officers surrounded the fallen man, making sure he couldn't try anything else stupid. One officer knelt down and checked to see if he was badly injured. Apart from some scrapes and bruises and probably a very sore back, the man seemed to be okay physically. "Can you stand up?" the officer asked. The man nodded weakly and slowly got to his feet with help. His legs were shaky and he looked like he might fall down again at any moment. The crowd behind the barrier started talking all at once. Everyone wanted to tell their friends and family what they had just witnessed. Phones buzzed with text messages and social media posts. Within minutes, the whole world would know about what happened at Buckingham Palace. "Did you see how fast he moved?" one tourist asked another. "I blinked and it was over." "That guard is like a ninja or something," said a teenager who had filmed the whole thing on his phone. "This is going to get millions of views online." A mother pulled her young son closer to her. "Those guards aren't just for decoration, honey," she explained. "They're real soldiers who know how to protect people." The guard slowly returned to his original position, but he kept his eyes on the arrested man and the surrounding crowd. His job wasn't over just because the immediate threat had been stopped. He needed to stay alert in case there were other troublemakers around. Other guards at their posts throughout the palace grounds had seen what happened, but they stayed at their positions. They trusted their fellow soldier to handle the situation, and they knew that leaving their posts might create security gaps that could be dangerous. The arrested man was having handcuffs put on his wrists behind his back. He wasn't struggling anymore. The fight had gone out of him completely when he hit the ground. Now he just looked tired and confused, like he was waking up from a bad dream. "Why did you do that?" one of the officers asked him, but the man just shook his head. Maybe he didn't know why he'd done it. Maybe he was embarrassed about how badly his plan had failed. Or maybe he was still too shocked to speak clearly. Palace security guards in plain clothes were also arriving on the scene. These were different from the ceremonial guards in red uniforms. They wore regular business suits but carried serious weapons and communication equipment. Their job was to handle exactly these kinds of incidents. The head of palace security, a former military officer himself, approached the guard who had made the takedown. "Outstanding work," he said quietly so the tourists wouldn't hear. "Textbook execution." The young guard nodded but didn't smile or show any emotion. He was still on duty, and celebrating wasn't appropriate while there were still crowds of people around who might cause more trouble. Paramedics arrived with a stretcher, just in case the arrested man needed medical attention. They checked his pulse and looked at his scraped hands and face, but he seemed to be fine except for being sore and embarrassed. "Just bruises," one paramedic reported. "Nothing broken. He's lucky the guard knew what he was doing." The man was indeed lucky. If he had tried this same stunt with an untrained security guard or police officer, he might have been seriously hurt. The ceremonial guard's precise training had stopped him safely without causing any permanent damage. As the police led the attacker away toward their van, he looked back once at the guard who had defeated him so easily. The guard stared straight ahead, already back in his ceremonial pose, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But everyone who had witnessed those 3 seconds would remember them for the rest of their lives. The next few minutes were like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, except the dancers were police officers, security guards, and paramedics all working together to handle the chaos that had just exploded in front of Buckingham Palace. While the arrested man sat on the ground rubbing his sore back and looking completely defeated, more help kept arriving from every direction. Police cars with flashing blue lights pulled up to the palace gates. Their sirens had been turned off so they wouldn't scare the tourists even more, but their presence made it clear that this was being taken very seriously. The guard who had made the takedown remained at his post, standing as straight and still as a statue. His rifle was held in exactly the same position as before, as if nothing had happened. But everyone could see that his eyes were more alert now, scanning the crowd for any other potential threats. Most of the tourists were still in shock. They stood behind the barrier with their mouths hanging open, trying to process what they had just seen. Many of them had their phones out, recording videos and taking pictures that would soon be shared all over the internet. "I can't believe that just happened," whispered an elderly woman to her husband. "Those guards really do know how to fight." "I told you they weren't just for show, dear," her husband replied, though he looked just as surprised as she did. A group of college students from Australia were practically bouncing with excitement. "Did you get that on video?" one of them asked his friend. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen in real life." But not everyone was excited. Some parents were holding their children close, worried that more violence might happen. A few families decided to leave and find somewhere safer to spend their afternoon. They'd come to London for a peaceful vacation, not to witness what looked like a real-life action movie. The police officers who had arrested the troublemaker were now dealing with all the paperwork that comes after incidents like this. They had to take statements from witnesses, fill out reports, and make sure they had all the evidence they needed for court later. One officer, a veteran who had worked around the palace for many years, shook his head in amazement. "In 15 years on this job, I've seen people try all sorts of stupid things," he told his partner. "But trying to disarm a Queen's Guard? That's a new level of crazy." His partner, who was newer to the job, was still learning about how these situations worked. How did the guard know exactly what to do? It happened so fast. "These boys train for months before they get posted here," the older officer explained. "Hand-to-hand combat, weapon retention, crowd control. They know it all." Most people think they're just pretty uniforms, but they're elite soldiers. Meanwhile, the palace security team was reviewing everything that had happened. They had cameras positioned all around the grounds, and they wanted to study the incident from every angle. This would help them improve their security procedures and train their people better for future problems. The head of security, a serious-looking man in his 50s, was already planning the meetings he would need to have. There would be reports to write, procedures to review, and discussions about whether any changes needed to be made to keep everyone safer. But privately, he was proud of how well his team had handled the situation. The guard had performed exactly as trained, the police had responded quickly, and no innocent people had been hurt. From a professional standpoint, it had been a textbook example of how to handle a security threat. The arrested man was now sitting in the back of a police van, still looking confused and sore. A paramedic had bandaged the scrapes on his hands and checked him over one more time to make sure he didn't have any serious injuries. "What's your name?" one of the officers asked him. But the man just stared at the floor and mumbled something nobody could understand. It was clear that whatever had driven him to attempt such a foolish act, he was now facing the reality of what he had done. The charges against him would be serious. Attempting to steal a weapon from a military guard, trespassing on royal property, disturbing the peace. He was looking at the possibility of several years in prison. All for a few seconds of madness that had ended with him flat on his back on the palace stones. Back at the gates, the crowd was slowly starting to return to normal, though everyone was still talking about what they had witnessed. Tour guides were trying to get their groups organized again. Parents were calming down their excited children, and the usual flow of sightseeing was beginning to resume. But the atmosphere had changed. There was an electric feeling in the air, like the moment after lightning strikes nearby. Everyone felt more aware, more alert. They looked at the guards differently now, with more respect and maybe a little bit of fear. One of the other guards, still standing motionless at his post about 30 feet away, had watched the entire incident without moving a muscle. He was proud of his fellow soldier, but also relieved that he hadn't been the one who had to deal with the attacker. These situations were always stressful, even when you handled them perfectly. The guard who had made the takedown was trying to ignore all the attention he was getting. People kept pointing at him and taking his picture, which made his job harder. He was supposed to be focused on security, not posing for tourist photos. A reporter from a local London newspaper had somehow heard about the incident and arrived with a photographer. They wanted to interview witnesses and get the story for the evening edition. The reporter approached several tourists, asking them to describe what they had seen. "It was incredible," said a businessman who had watched everything from just a few feet away. One second the crazy guy thought he had the upper hand, and the next second he was on the ground wondering what hit him. That guard moved like he had superhuman powers. A teenage girl who had filmed the whole thing on her phone was already uploading it to social media. "This is going to go viral for sure," she told her friends. "Everyone's going to want to see how those guards really handle troublemakers." The palace staff were also dealing with the aftermath. They needed to clean up the area where the incident had happened, check that all the security barriers were still secure, and make sure that normal operations could continue without any more disruptions. The stones where the man had fallen were scraped and scuffed from the impact. Maintenance workers would need to clean them up later, though they had seen much worse damage over the centuries. The palace had survived wars, riots, and countless other incidents. One confused troublemaker wasn't going to leave any permanent marks. As the police van drove away with the arrested man inside, many of the tourists waved goodbye, though not in a friendly way. They were glad to see the person who had scared them being taken away to face justice. The whole incident had lasted less than 5 minutes from start to finish, but it had felt much longer to everyone involved. Time has a way of stretching out during moments of high stress and drama. Now, as things settled back to normal, people began to realize just how professional and well-trained the palace security really was. The guard had handled a dangerous situation with skill and restraint, using exactly the right amount of force to stop the threat without causing unnecessary harm. Tourists who had been planning to visit other parts of London decided to stay at the palace longer, hoping to see more of these impressive guards in action. They had gotten much more excitement than they had bargained for, and they wanted to make sure they didn't miss anything else interesting. But the guards remained at their posts, silent and watchful, ready to handle whatever might happen next. For them, this was just another day at work. protecting one of the most famous buildings in the world. 3 hours after the incident, the man who had tried to grab the guard's rifle was sitting in a small gray room at the local police station. The excitement and adrenaline that had driven him to do something so foolish were completely gone now, replaced by the cold reality of what he had gotten himself into. The charges against him were serious and would follow him for the rest of his life. Attempted theft of a military weapon was a major crime in Britain. Trespassing on royal property was another serious offense. Disturbing the peace and threatening a member of the armed forces added even more legal trouble to his growing list of problems. His name was finally revealed as Tommy Wilson, a 28-year-old man from a rough neighborhood in East London. He had been unemployed for over a year, struggling with depression and alcohol problems that had gotten worse and worse over the past few months. Friends and family would later say they had seen him becoming more unstable, but nobody expected him to do anything this dramatic and stupid. "Why did you do it?" the police detective asked him during his interview. Tommy just stared at the table and shook his head. Even he couldn't really explain what had driven him to jump that barrier and attack a trained soldier. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was mental illness. Maybe it was just the worst decision a person could possibly make on what started as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Back at Buckingham Palace, life was returning to normal, but the story of what had happened was spreading around the world faster than anyone could have imagined. The videos that tourists had recorded on their phones were being shared millions of times on social media platforms. The footage showed everything in crystal clear detail. Tommy jumping the barrier like a man possessed, his wild sprint across the forbidden palace grounds, the moment his hand touched the guard's rifle, and then the lightning-fast takedown that left him groaning on the ancient stones. News channels picked up the story within hours. "Foolish man tries to disarm royal guard, gets instant justice," read one headline. "Palace guard shows why you don't mess with the Queen's security," said another. The story was being broadcast on television screens in dozens of countries. The young guard who had performed the takedown was becoming famous, though he didn't want to be. Military rules meant he couldn't talk to reporters or give interviews about what had happened. His job was to protect the palace, not to be a celebrity, but his fellow soldiers were proud of him. Back at the barracks that evening, other guards patted him on the back and bought him drinks. They all knew that any one of them might have to deal with a similar situation someday, and seeing their friend handle it so perfectly gave them confidence in their own training. "You made it look easy," one of his friends told him over dinner. "That idiot had no idea what he was getting into when he messed with one of us." The guard himself was modest about the whole thing. "It's just what we trained for," he said. Anyone here would have done the same thing. But privately he was relieved that everything had gone so well. His first real test as a royal guard had been passed with flying colors. The commanding officer of the Queen's Guard unit also had to deal with the publicity. Reporters wanted to know more about how these soldiers were trained and whether incidents like this happened often. He gave carefully worded statements that praised his soldiers' professionalism while avoiding giving away any secrets about their security procedures. "Our guards are highly trained professionals," he told the press. "They are prepared to handle a wide variety of situations while ensuring the safety of the royal family and the general public." Today's incident was resolved quickly and professionally with minimal disruption. What he didn't mention was how many hours of training had gone into that 3-second takedown. The physical conditioning, the combat practice, the weapon retention drills, the lessons in staying calm under pressure. All of it had come together perfectly when it mattered most. The incident also sparked a larger conversation about mental health and security. Tommy Wilson's friends and family spoke to reporters about how he had been struggling with depression and unemployment. They didn't excuse what he had done, but they wanted people to understand that he wasn't normally a violent or dangerous person. "He was just lost," said his sister during a tearful interview. "He'd been having a hard time for months, but we never thought he would do anything like this. He needs help, not just punishment." Mental health experts use the incident to talk about the importance of getting help for people who are struggling with psychological problems. They pointed out that while Tommy's actions were inexcusable, they might have been prevented if he had received proper treatment for his depression and substance abuse issues. At the same time, security experts praised the response of the palace guards and police. They analyzed the video footage and pointed out all the things that had gone right. The guard had used minimal force, no innocent bystanders had been hurt, and the threat had been neutralized quickly and efficiently. "This is exactly how these situations should be handled," said one former military officer who now worked as a security consultant. The guard showed excellent judgment and skill. He could have used much more force, but he chose to use only what was necessary to stop the threat. The video of the takedown became one of the most watched clips on the internet that week. It was shared on news sites, social media platforms, and video sharing websites around the world. People watched it over and over, amazed by the guard's quick thinking and professional response. Some viewers used the incident to make jokes about people who underestimate the Queen's guards. "Those guys aren't just pretty uniforms," became a popular comment on social media. "They're real soldiers who know how to handle business." Others focused on the lesson about respecting authority and following rules. Parents showed the video to their children as an example of what happens when you don't listen to warnings and try to do dangerous things. Tourism officials in London were initially worried that the incident might scare visitors away from Buckingham Palace. But the opposite happened. More people wanted to visit the palace to see these impressive guards for themselves. Hotel bookings actually increased in the weeks following the incident, as people from around the world planned trips to London, specifically to see where the famous takedown had occurred. The palace gift shop even started selling t-shirts with slogans like, "Don't mess with the Queen's Guard" and "Palace Security." Professionals at work. These became popular souvenirs among tourists who wanted to remember the story of Tommy Wilson's very bad day. 6 months later, Tommy appeared in court for his trial. He pleaded guilty to all the charges against him and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, though he would likely serve only half that time with good behavior. The judge said that while his mental health problems were a factor, his actions had been dangerous and could not be excused. "You put yourself, the guard, and innocent tourists at risk with your reckless behavior," the judge told him. The fact that no one was seriously injured is due to the professionalism of the palace security, not to any restraint on your part. Tommy's lawyer had asked for a lighter sentence, arguing that his client had been suffering from severe depression and hadn't been thinking clearly. But the prosecutor pointed out that attacking a military guard could have resulted in much worse consequences if the soldier hadn't been so well trained. The guard who had made the takedown was called to testify at the trial, though his testimony was brief and professional. He simply described what had happened and confirmed that he had used appropriate force to stop the threat. He didn't show any anger or emotion toward Tommy, treating the whole thing as just part of his job. After the trial, Tommy's family said they hoped he would get the mental health treatment he needed while in prison. They also apologized publicly to the guard and to all the tourists who had been scared by the incident. The story became a legend that was told and retold among the Queen's guards for years to come. New recruits learned about it during their training as an example of how proper preparation and quick thinking could turn a potentially dangerous situation into a textbook example of professional security work. Guard himself eventually moved on to other assignments, but he was always known as the soldier who had handled the Buckingham Palace incident so perfectly. He never got tired of younger guards asking him to tell the story one more time. And at Buckingham Palace, the tourists kept coming, the guards kept standing their posts, and life continued much as it had for centuries. But everyone who worked there remembered the day when one foolish man learned the hard way that the Queen's guards are much more than just fancy uniforms and tall hats. They are professionals who take their job seriously, and they're very, very good at what they do.